The Holy Land has always been a special part of Belfast, a diverse area, densely populated, just a mile from the city centre and on the banks of the River Lagan. In recent times, it has made the headlines for the wrong reasons, associated with late night partying from some of the student population in the area. This has led to a negative reputation. But residents in the area are keen to write their own history going forward, to capture a shared vision for the area. This is the most diverse part of Belfast, with many ethnic communities living here, along with long-term residents and short-term residents. Forward South Partnership is working with the residents, primarily through our community capacity builder, Melanie Watson Holmes. She's been meeting with the various residents groups and residents in the area, helping them to express their views, having out conversations with them, what they see as the vision for the area. We are also working with Eamon Phoenix, who is engaging with residents to capture the history of the area. It has an interesting and long-standing history as one of the traditional parts of Belfast, and we are wanting to retell those stories, many of which maybe have been lost in the mists of time. This is an area where the residents can write their own history. They can decide on how they want their community to be going forwards. So we invite you now to sit back and relax and listen to some of the stories of the past, some of those special stories about this special part of Belfast.
My name is Frankie. I'm a local resident. I've lived here all my life, which is over 60 years, 61 years. My parents lived here before me, and my grandmother lived in the house on the corner of Rugby Road and University Avenue. So I'm definitely a local resident and one of the longest term residents living here. It's been a fantastic place to live, still is, but I've seen all the changes through the years, but it's great. Childhood, everybody knew everybody, all the houses, we would have known everybody in Rugby Road because you went to school with everybody, even people in what they call the Holy Land. They all went to maybe Botanic Primary School or some of the other local schools, and then if you were lucky enough you went on to one of the grammar schools. I mean, most people cried their eyes out the day they finished Botanic Primary School because it was your happiest times. Moving on to big school, as they called it.
I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1946 after my father came home from the war. There were lots of children my age in the area. It was the most wonderful area to grow up in because it was convenient for shops. Botanic Avenue was round the corner. You could walk into the city centre. You had this park, which is the best park in the city, because it had the Palm House, that wonderful place over there, place of magic that we lived in, the museum, the river, you know, and it was safe. There was no traffic. You could play in the streets. Your parents could allow you to come up into the park to play on your own because it was safe and no one worried about it.
I think the area still has a lot of positivity, and I think people get that feeling when they come into it, especially places like Wildflower Alley. They're absolutely, totally amazed that somewhere like this exists in the heart of university area. They can't believe that the community got together to do it and all pulled together, and we did it all ourselves really from the beginning, and how many awards we've won. So, and we get people visiting, you know, people who want to be able to have areas like this in their area. So we've had people, busloads come from Lagan because they wanted to. see what they could do in you know, the rundown alleys in their area. So, and we have had quite a lot of people take up, you know, the lower Ormo, and I think there's one in North Belfast and further on up the Ormo Road. And I think the council, different councils, I don't just mean South Belfast, but have seen the positive feeling and getting the community together to work together. And then of course we work with projects from Queen's, from the University of Ulster. Any cross-community groups, charities that want to maybe bring kids along to see. Some kids don't even know where a potato comes from, and you can just grow a potato in a flower pot. So it's been absolutely amazing, really.
This is Wildflower Alley. We started this 6 years ago, and we started this with the intention not just of developing a green alley here, but of expanding throughout the Holy Land. It's an ideal location, the Holy Land. It looks out onto the Lagan. It has many historical features, and there are some green spaces that we wanted to develop, one of these being Horsey Hill. Once we started Wildflower Alley, it took off like wildflowers, and everywhere in Belfast people were developing alleys. In response to this, the Department for Infrastructure Minister Nicola Mallon announced a funding scheme, and this has given us extra impetus to develop Horsey Hill. Horsey Hill at the minute is in a terrible state, but we know that we can really rejuvenate it. Years and years ago, it united the land with the sea. It looks out onto the Lagan. It has the history of the horses and carts pulling up provisions from the Lagan to the growing city of Belfast. It's just got a brilliant history.
We have seen how some of the areas have been developed. The Wildflower Alley area, if you look at the houses that back onto that in College Park Avenue and University Street, it has regenerated the housing in that area. Rugby Road is still a good place in terms of housing and the conditions of living in that. The planners can get things right. They can encourage families and people who want inner city life.
I think people don't realise the influence that a green area has on their mental health, and the kids to see that things can grow and where they come from, and they can just go out in the garden and pick a tomato or a scallion, or I mean they've really no idea where these things come from. And you know, to see a pear tree growing here, whatever, and the kids can come out and pick a pear. You know, it's really quite unbelievable, things that we would have taken for granted as children. So to get them involved and, you know, to see what they can do and to see the fun that they have is quite unbelievable. You know, some of them have never painted a fence or done anything like that. It's just, and they're so happy. So I think, and certainly if we're going to have different people coming into the area of different religions, different races, different everything, just so lovely to be able to mix with all of them.
The Horsey Hill, that's a throwback to you know, the 19th century, and the stables for the horses that pull the canals, where they changed the horses, you know, like a Wells Fargo outpost.
So Horsey Hill is an important landmark. It's an important public realm project, and we feel that it could be well supported by this new fund, and certainly residents are very, very keen to develop it. People use it as a shortcut from the embankment up into the Holy Land. It runs up into Agincourt Avenue, so it is the main thoroughfare. But the exciting thing about it, I think, is that it looks out onto the Lagan. We don't appreciate the river enough, and we should. And it shows that our area, as a diverse and multicultural area, is returning to its roots, its history, its use of the natural environment, and really it could become a very interesting project to develop Horsey Hill.
It is my pleasure to introduce Eamon Phoenix, local historian who will tell you some of the special stories about the Holy Land area.
We're standing here on the banks of the Lagan, really, on the edge of the Holy Land, beside some late Victorian cottages known as Southview Cottage. The area is dotted with cottages from the middle of the 19th century. There were several actually in the Holy Land area. We're looking at the River Lagan, which has always been a kind of a living channel in this area, the focus of children's play, of boating, and of course of industrial activity, because this was the Lagan Canal from the late 18th century right through to the 1950s. The area we're currently in is actually the Annandale Embankment. It's actually very modern. It was finished in 1929 as a kind of relief scheme during the high unemployment of that period. But before then we had high banks here, waste ground overlooking the River Lagan. And we have a couple of autobiographical accounts which describe children playing here, skimming stones in the Lagan, bathing here in the summertime. The Lagan swim went on to the 1950s. Just about here. And of course you also had the activity on the Lagan Canal, the lighters coming up and down. The lighter men would lower the funnel, passing under the Ormeau Bridge here. And the horses, of course, would pull the barges along all the way to Lough Neagh. This was very exciting for kids up to about 1955 when it all stopped. And of course the Holy Land area was developed really by two businessmen in the 1890s. One was an estate agent called Robert McConnell, R.J. McConnell, and the developer was a man called James Ray. And together McConnell and Ray toured the Holy Land about 1894, and they visited Damascus and they visited Jerusalem, and they learnt about the Crusades, and they came back here and they acquired a large site of land on what had been the Crummock Woods estate. This old area was quite wooded, was sort of festooned with hedges at that time on the fringes of the Botanic Gardens. So McConnell and his friend James Ray began to develop streets of housing here, finished around 1899, early 1900s. The area was designed as housing for the skilled working classes, people who were working in the shipyards and engineering firms. And that's how it was seen really in the 1911 census. You have a lot of people who are working as, you know, carpenters, riveters, sheet metal workers in the shipyard. You have electricians, which was a new profession. You have linen lappers, people working in the linen industry. So it's that kind of rich kind of medley of people rearing their families here on the banks of the Lagan in this brand new area, which became known initially as the Holy Land because of that famous tour by McConnell and his developer friend, and then more recently it's called the Holy Lands. We're standing here in the Lagan Embankment looking towards Molly Ward's Loch, which is just down there beyond the King's Bridge. This of course was where the Lagan joined the old Lagan Canal. 27 lochs went from here from the mid 18th century to Lough Neagh, linking the Lagan navigation, the port of Belfast with the Shannon system. The idea was that Ireland would have a network of canals, and the aim was to link Belfast to the County Tyrone coalfields. So coal was being brought from Coal Island right down the canal here into Belfast. And a lot of people who lived in the Holy Land worked as haulers on the canal, as lightermen on the lighters or barges which floated up here. And if you're standing here 100 years ago, you would have seen the lighters going by, men leading the horses, pulling the strong ropes that brought them up here. The first loch, just about half a mile from here, was called Molly Ward's Loch. And Molly Ward, of course, was a local tavern owner in the area. Molly Ward's was a famous pub which served a famous meal in the 18th century called curds and cream. It seems to have been some sort of bread and butter pudding. And it was there that the United Irishmen, people like Wolfe Tone and Henry John McCracken, gathered in the days before the 1798 rebellion. So it's a very, very historic Lagan, and of course through time the Lagan Canal closed in the 50s, and this became the Lagan Valley Country Park, and it's still a famous place for walks and recreation for people from the Holy Land of all ages. So really a very, very historic area with so many important buildings, historical personalities, historical associations, going right back to early times. We're standing in Agincourt Avenue, actually in the heart of the Holy Land. Until the 1890s, this area was known as the Crummock Woods Estate, a very rural area really, adjoining the Botanic Gardens. But of course, it was developed by R.J. McConnell and his friend, the developer, James Ray, from 1894 on, as a kind of an upper working class area, streets well let out, smaller houses perhaps on Carmel Street, Damascus Street to our right here, and then you had the 2.5, 3 stories houses here for the skilled workers, for the printers, the engineers, the carpenters who worked in the shipyard. At the other end, of course, lay the Royal Botanic Gardens, as they were when they opened in 1829, a private park, but by the 1890s they had become a public park under the care of Belfast Corporation. And for older people who wanted to recreate, who wanted to play bowls, or wanted to hear the band of the Royal Irish Constabulary playing of a summer evening, in the early 20th century, the Botanic Gardens was the great draw. And of course, it was the magical childhood kind of draw for children in the area who would go to the puzzle paths, the tropical ravine, the palm house, and all of that in the long course of the 20th century. We're standing here at the Palm House in Belfast Botanic Gardens, really very much the park preferred by people in the Holy Land right down to the present day. It was once called Mr. MacDowell's Farm, and it was set up by a local society with a commissioner at the gates who charged people an entrance fee. It then became known as the Royal Belfast Botanic Gardens, and it wasn't really until 1894 that it was finally taken over by the City Council and opened to the public. The Palm House, of course, was always a major draw, finalised in 1852. It's a unique building really in Ireland, you know, of glass and steel, and of course has always been famous for its tropical plants. But in the gardens here, people used to assemble in the 1860s, 70s, 80s to see famous balloon ascents, because balloons would be launched here, sort of fueled by hydrogen, with great crowds gathering, usually around Easter Monday in the 19th century. In 1864, for example, 11 people ascended in the big field here by balloon, a great success. But in 1867, a man called William Hodgsman tried to ascend by balloon. He was very famous. He'd crossed the Irish Sea by balloon, but unfortunately his balloon didn't ascend. The crowd became restless. They were waiting here for hours, probably about 10,000 people, and eventually a riot broke out. The punters weren't happy. Some of them may actually have been from the Holy Land. We can't be absolutely sure. Other famous things in this area, of course, well, a famous unionist convention was held against Home Rule here in 1892, addressed by the Duke of Abercorn. Something like 10,000 people just at the sort of Agincourt Avenue end of the park, the famous convention. And also, of course, in 1859 you had the great religious revival, and Dr. Henry Cook, the black man, addressed a famous meeting here, about 50,000 people, in connection with the evangelical revival in 1860. So the garden's very famous. One young man who grew up in the Holy Land in the years before the First World War describes coming to play in the park here with this kind of puzzle paths. The remains of the old Belfast water supply passed through here. So the Botanic Gardens is inextricably linked really to the Holy Land, and still, of course, resorted to day and daily by people of every age and every generation.
Behind me is Botanic Primary School, one of the most diverse schools in Belfast. Who better to tell us the stories of this school than the principal, Mr. Paul Bell?
Obviously 1939 was coming towards the start of World War II, and there was this architect called Wiltshire, and he's quite famous in architectural history because allegedly he designed a number of schools which were innovative in their own respect. This particular building, as you see it, well, the frontage will not have changed much, but down the side of the school where we have the dining hall that a lot of you will be familiar with, apparently that dining hall didn't exist. The fence beside the school didn't exist because Wiltshire's aim was to create these schools in communities that were beside water, obviously the Lagan, and were beside parks, so the children could run and have free access from the various buildings. And I can only imagine what this looked like in 1939 when the school was opened, because if you could open the doors and let the children literally run freely in the park, well then what a resource on your doorstep. Now there were other schools like Elm Grove and Grove. As I say, there are a whole number of schools because Wiltshire was obviously the architect of the day back then, and this was his ideal. The surrounding area basically lends itself to having a school. I mean, these houses have been certainly around across the street from before 1939, and a number of the people in those houses would have availed of the services of the school. But the park was obviously of vital importance, and all of those natural features. Obviously, Queen's has been about since long before that. The PEC mightn't have been there, and I'm sure the Lagan's been there for a long, long time. So all of these features would have just allowed the children to get out and explore the outdoors. Of course, at that stage, when you came to this school, you didn't move on to what we call big school in today's terms. You stayed at the one school, so you came here at perhaps 6 or 7. And that's significant because a lot of children would have started their school down in maybe an infant school and then come to this school 6 or 7 years old, stayed here until they were 14, and then moved on to a various job, profession, technical college or whatever. So this school has a special relationship historically with the school that was in the Donegal Pass, which has obviously now been closed. But the one thing that Botanic Primary School is well noted for is the multicultural aspect. Child that sort of came to Belfast and the surrounding area that didn't speak English as their first language seems to have been directed for many years towards Botanic Primary School. Now, while we didn't have the English language unit here as a unit, and I know that up until the 1980s, the Belfast Education and Library Board ran their English as an additional language service from a room in that particular room, headed by the very same Mr. Tandon, who's still with us and still teaching English in this school. I would argue we've been building the next generation for the last generation, because if you look at Northern Ireland schooling, it's along 3 main lines: controlled, maintained or integrated. Really in this school, that's language that we have abandoned 20 years ago. We have, looking at our immediate catchment, the Holylands, which is any religion, any language. We have communities on either side of the Ormeau Road which would be fairly well entrenched in one of the 2 main traditions. But yet I would argue that in this particular school, children are children, and children become friends, and children don't look at traditional communities. And so we break down many, many barriers just by children becoming friends, because when children become friends, then their parents traditionally become friends, and you have parents who are taking their children to play in areas where they hitherto would not have gone before, and all of a sudden finding, well, people are people, and it doesn't really matter the colour of your skin, because Your child could have a birthday party and their group of friends could be from both traditional communities and many other communities beside, all being educated successfully in an inclusive environment. And so I would argue, controversially some might say, that we are the most integrated primary school on the island of Ireland.
We're standing in a very unique part, really, of the Holy Land. The street, really, between, I suppose, College Park Avenue and modern University Street was once known as Caledonia Street. The name disappeared in the 1920s and it became an extension of Rugby Road. I suppose this part of the Holy Land is marked by two famous churches. Behind us here we have the famous White Church, an iconic building really going back to 1936. This is the only example of a public building in Ireland by the famous Welsh architect Clough Williams Ellis. He's the man who designed Portmeirion in Wales. The White Church, of course, is designed in an Art Deco style. It's now an evangelical church, but was once the Church of Christian Science here in the Holy Lands. Just beyond it, of course, is a much older church, which is Fitzroy Presbyterian Church. Its black tower kind of dominating the landscape at this end. It was designed by Robert M. Young, famous Belfast architect, in Scrabo sandstone, and has been standing here at the corner of Rugby Road and University Street since 1874. In the area we have two historic houses, I suppose, once occupied by famous people. In this row here of Rugby Road, once called Caledonia Street, lived a man called the Reverend Frederick O'Connell. He was a Church of Ireland clergyman. He was a lecturer in Celtic and Queens. He lived here really during the First World War. He was also a writer in English and Irish. And in English he wrote famous ghost stories, some of them under the pen name Connor Mc because he came from Connemara in the west of Ireland, and he was a native Irish speaker, although a Protestant clergyman. He later became actually a director of the Irish Broadcasting Organisation, RTE, in the 1920s. One of the first houses here in Magdala Street, one of the classic streets of the Holy Land, was born in 1883 a man called Bulmer Hobson. He was described in his prime as the most dangerous man in Ireland. Hobson belonged to a Quaker family. He was brought up in this area. He became a journalist. He became a founder of the Gaelic League in Belfast, a founder of the GAA in the city, the Ulster Literary Theatre, but most importantly, he was a member of that secret group of the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, who planned the Easter Rising of 1916. And his autobiography, published in 1968, Ireland Yesterday and Tomorrow, is still a very important read for people interested in Irish history. So a very historic area in terms of its architecture, of the churches, and of course the fact that two important people lived here, Bulmer Hobson and the Reverend Frederick O'Connell. This is a gem on the edge of the Holy Land here, Union Theological College, built for the Presbyterian Church and for the education of Presbyterian ministers in 1853. The architect, of course, was Charles Lanyon, the man who built Queen's University, Crumlin Road Jail, indeed the man who built Victorian Belfast. The building is forever associated with the Reverend Dr. Henry Cook, the famous 19th century Presbyterian divine who was known as the Presbyterian Pope. Henry Cook, of course, was the man who left a permanent imprint on the Presbyterian Church in Ireland. He was opposed to nationalism, to liberalism, to popery, and indeed he took over the church very much in the course of the 19th century. He became professor of rhetoric here, and his statue, of course, is the Black Man statue down in the city centre. But of course the Presbyterian College had a second historical incarnation in 1921, when this became the home of the new Parliament of Northern Ireland. It was here, for example, that the House of Commons met upstairs on the first floor in the library, and of course the famous Senate met downstairs in the chapel to 1932. All the famous acts of the Northern Ireland Parliament in its early years were passed here. The Special Powers Act of 1922, the abolition of proportional representation in 1929, all of those acts were passed here. The building itself, of course, is a powerful Renaissance structure with these great Doric columns with the recessed doors, really a masterpiece of Victorian architecture on the edge of the Holy Land.
What makes the Holy Land unique for me is the whole cultural thing of living in a university area. It's lovely to have, you know, such diverse people coming to study from all over the world, and the reputation that Queen's University has. The many different religions and churches that we do have here prior to lockdown, all the lovely social places we do have, the theatres, the music centres, the, you know, outdoor events that can take place. You know, the Botanic Gardens are fantastic things for lots of events. So, you know, and all communities have used them over the years for many different things. I'd like to see that continue.
I don't think the Holy Land is ripe for gentrification, but it is ripe for regeneration as a good area to live in and a good, safe area in which to raise families. And if the planners get it right, instead of, you know, just developing homes of multiple occupancy for transient people living there, of making it attractive for people to come and live there. There's still good schools in the area. There's still access to all the facilities. Do you know? It would be nice if we got more Queen's academic staff living in the area and not just Rugby Road, which was traditionally, you know, you would find 2 or 3 professors living there. So it would be great to see, you know, Queen's maintaining an interest in the area, memories and people that I associate with the area, but also the feeling that I have and look for and where it is that I want to live. Now that I'm on my own and retired, I want somewhere comfortable, safe, where I feel at home. And although I found it now very close to the Holy Land, you know, this area still offers opportunities. It's such a great part of the city to live in, despite the bad reputation that it has had.
I'd like to thank everyone from the team here for participating in this, and I hope that you find the history of the area interesting. Not many people know about the diversity that has always been here and the diversity that we hope to build on in the future. Post-COVID is a time for new beginnings for everybody, and in particular for all the greening projects we want to do in the Holy Land. We've had a spring gathering every year to mark the beginning of spring, and this year we hope that everyone will see the recovery that's going to happen and that you will join with us in developing new beginnings. So everyone, thanks very much for watching. Hope you find this short film interesting. And thanks for all those who participated, gave of their time and their expertise. This spring gathering is a sign of hope for the future, and again, thank you and have a happy and peaceful St Patrick's Day 2021.